Forget about that old image of a gold prospector sitting by a riverbank, shaking a metal pan looking for a golden nugget. The gold rush has changed. And the curious thing is that this time, the treasure might be hidden inside a stone that to you wouldn't look special at all. Lithium, cobalt, nickel, rare earths. Names that sound like they were pulled straight from a chemistry exam nobody studied for. But today they are at the center of one of the greatest economic and geopolitical struggles on the planet. And there is one question behind all of this. Why are the United States, China, and Europe so obsessed with controlling these minerals? The answer starts with a transformation that is changing how we produce and consume energy. We are trying to slowly move away from fossil fuels and build an increasingly electrified economy. Electric cars, solar panels, wind turbines, giant batteries, that iPhone 45 Pro Max Turbo Ultra Power, smartphones, computers, and practically all the tech we carry in our pockets. It seems like a clean and inevitable revolution. But there is a small detail hidden in this story. To build all of this, we need minerals. And not just a few. An electric car battery, for example, depends on materials capable of storing massive amounts of energy in very little space. That is where lithium comes in. Nickel helps increase the energy density of certain batteries. Cobalt can improve stability and performance. And so-called rare earths are essential for various tech components, including the magnets used in electric motors and turbines. Meaning, that transition that seems to happen just by pressing a button on a dashboard actually starts thousands of feet below the surface. And here is the first big twist of this story. Energy may be renewable, but the infrastructure that produces, stores, and transports that energy has to be built with raw materials pulled straight out of the earth. It's like swapping the gas station for a wall outlet. It sounds simple, until you ask yourself, okay, but where did that outlet come from? And that is precisely where the real race begins. For a good chunk of the 20th century, oil was synonymous with power. Whoever controlled vast oil reserves could influence prices, alliances, wars, and even political decisions all across the globe. Oil was practically the lifeblood of the industrial economy. Now imagine that the world is trying to change that entire system. Cars need batteries. Power grids need to store energy. Wind turbines need specialized components. Electronic systems are becoming increasingly sophisticated. And all of these sectors depend on extremely complex mining and processing chains. The new gold, therefore, doesn't need to look pretty. In fact, it can look like a completely boring rock. The real value lies in what's inside of it. And here comes a detail that tends to confuse a lot of people. Some of these minerals aren't necessarily that rare in nature. The real challenge is finding them in economically viable concentrations, extracting them, processing them, and above all, refining them. Because pulling a ton of ore out of the ground is only the beginning. What follows is a long chain of separation, chemical treatment, and processing. And that stage can be extremely expensive. That is precisely where geopolitics steps onto the stage. Because having a mine isn't enough. You have to master the technology, the infrastructure, and the industrial capacity required to turn that rock into a material that can actually go into a battery, a motor, or an electronic device. It's like owning a coffee plantation only to realize you don't have the machine to roast the beans. Congratulations on the farm. Now you actually have to make the coffee. And it's at this point that the struggle gets much more interesting. Because having the resource is one thing. Controlling the chain that turns that resource into technology is something completely different. And when billions of dollars, electric cars, artificial intelligence, renewable energy, and national security all start depending on that chain, a simple mine stops being just a mine. It turns into a strategic piece on the global chessboard. And maybe that's precisely why the next great clash between superpowers won't be over drilling for oil, but in places where, at first glance, there are only rocks.
Para entender por qué estos minerales se convirtieron en una obsesión del mundo moderno, tenemos que hacer algo simple: abrir la batería de prácticamente cualquier aparato que usamos todos los días. Tu celular, tu notebook, un auto eléctrico, hasta sistemas gigantes de almacenamiento de energía. Por fuera, parece solo una caja, pero allá adentro pasa una verdadera operación química. Pensá en la electricidad como un pasajero intentando cruzar una estación. Para hacer ese viaje miles de veces, entrando y saliendo de la batería sin destruir todo por el camino, necesitamos materiales muy específicos. Y es acá donde el litio entra en escena. El litio es extremadamente liviano y tiene propiedades electroquímicas que lo hacen uno de los materiales más importantes de las baterías recargables modernas. Él es el que participa en este proceso de movimiento de iones adentro de la batería, permitiendo guardar y liberar energía una y otra vez. En otras palabras, ese porcentaje que aparece en la esquina de tu celular diciendo 87% de batería, solo existe porque una pequeña operación química está pasando ahí adentro. Y probablemente nunca te paraste a agradecerle al litio por eso. Pero no trabaja solo. Según la tecnología de la batería, entran otros materiales importantes, como el níquel, el cobalto, el manganeso y el grafito. El cobalto, por ejemplo, puede ayudar a mejorar la estabilidad y el rendimiento de ciertas químicas de batería. Por su parte, el níquel puede contribuir a aumentar la cantidad de energía guardada en ciertas baterías. Es una especie de equipo. Cada elemento tiene su función. Y si sacas una pieza importante, la ingeniería tiene que encontrar otra forma de hacer funcionar el sistema. Solo que hay un problema mucho más grande escondido en esta historia. Estos materiales no aparecen en el mundo en cajitas chicas con una etiqueta que diga material para fabricar baterías. Estaría buenísimo. La minería sería mucho más fácil. Pero la naturaleza no trabaja con el catálogo de Mercado Libre. El litio, por ejemplo, puede estar presente en salmueras subterráneas de grandes regiones áridas. Para llegar al material que realmente le interesa a la industria, hay que extraer esa salmuera y pasar por una serie de etapas de concentración y procesamiento. En algunas regiones, esto implica enormes piletas de evaporación y procesos químicos para separar el litio de los otros elementos. O sea, la batería que cargas en unas pocas horas puede haber arrancado su historia en un ambiente completamente diferente, después de pasar por una cadena industrial gigantesca. Y el cobalto trae otro problema. Gran parte de la producción mundial está concentrada en la República Democrática del Congo. Esto hace que la cadena de suministro sea extremadamente importante desde el punto de vista económico, ambiental y social. La minería puede generar empleo y mover economías enteras. Pero también puede traer impactos ambientales, condiciones de trabajo difíciles y problemas vinculados a la fiscalización y la explotación ilegal. Y acá aparece una de las mayores contradicciones de la llamada transición energética.
To understand why these minerals became an obsession of the modern world, we have to do something simple. Open up the battery of virtually every device we use every single day. Your phone, your laptop, an electric car, even giant grid energy storage systems. From the outside, it just looks like a box. But inside, a full-blown chemical operation is taking place. Think of electricity as a passenger trying to cross a station. To make that journey thousands of times, moving in and out of the battery without destroying everything along the way, we need very specific materials. And this is where lithium enters the picture. Lithium is extremely lightweight and boasts electrochemical properties that make it one of the most critical elements in modern rechargeable batteries. It's the one taking part in that ion movement inside the battery, allowing energy to be stored and released over and over again. In other words, that percentage in the corner of your phone saying 87% battery only exists because a tiny chemical operation is happening right in there. And you probably never stopped to thank lithium for that. But it doesn't work alone. Depending on the battery technology, other key materials step in, such as nickel, cobalt, manganese, and graphite. Cobalt, for instance, can help improve stability and performance in certain battery chemistries. Nickel, on the other hand, can help boost the amount of energy stored in certain batteries. It's a team effort. Every element has its role. And if you pull out a key player, engineering has to figure out another way to make the system work. Except there is a much bigger problem hidden in this story. These materials don't just show up in the world in neat little boxes with a label saying, Battery Manufacturing Materials. That would be amazing. Mining would be so much easier. But nature doesn't ship with Amazon Prime. Lithium, for example, can be found in subterranean brines beneath vast arid regions. To get to the material the industry actually cares about, you have to extract that brine and push it through a series of concentration and processing stages. In some regions, this involves massive evaporation ponds and chemical processes to separate lithium from all the other elements. Meaning, the battery you charge in just a few hours might have started its journey in a completely different environment, after passing through a colossal industrial chain. And cobalt brings a whole other problem to the table. A vast portion of global production is concentrated in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. This makes the supply chain extremely significant from an economic, environmental, and social standpoint. Mining can generate jobs and power entire economies. But it can also bring environmental impacts, harsh working conditions, and issues tied to regulation and illegal exploitation. And that is precisely where one of the greatest contradictions of the so-called energy transition comes to light. You have the resource, but you don't control the final product. Something similar happens with rare earths. Whoever controls the processing manages to influence the flow that reaches the factories. And these elements are far from being used only for things we encounter in our everyday lives. They are fundamental in various types of high-performance permanent magnets. These magnets can be found in electric motors, wind turbines, electronic equipment, and also in advanced military applications. Meaning, the very same supply chain that helps build an electric car can also be tied to strategic defense technologies. And that's when the conversation stops being just about economics. It becomes geopolitical. Because imagine depending on another country to secure an essential component needed to build your own vehicles, wind turbines, electronic gear, or military systems. It's not exactly the ideal situation if you like sleeping soundly at night. Which is why the United States, European nations, and other global powers have started looking for alternatives. New mines, new suppliers, new processing technologies, and above all, new refineries. Because the ultimate battle isn't just about discovering where the ore is located. It's about figuring out who can transform that ore into something the industry can actually use. The new gold rush doesn't necessarily run through where the most minerals lie. It runs through where there is the capacity to transform that mineral into technological power. In the last century, controlling oil meant controlling a colossal portion of the global economy. Now, in an increasingly electrified and digital world, controlling certain raw materials and their processing chains can mean controlling a share of the technology driving that future. And that seemingly worthless rock we named at the very beginning? It starts making total sense now. Because, in certain corners of the planet, a rock isn't just a rock. It's a piece on a massive geopolitical chessboard. And the more dependent we become on these technologies, the more valuable the hand holding the key becomes. Because, depending on where you are and what is inside of it, that rock can be worth much more than it seems. It can represent a battery, an electric motor, a wind turbine, a smartphone, or even a strategic advantage for an entire country. In the 20th century, oil-fueled cars, airplanes, industries, and wars. In the 21st century, critical minerals could play a similar role. The difference is that, this time, the resource that defines power might be hidden inside a rock you would walk right past on the street without even realizing it. So, the next time you plug your phone in to charge, or see an electric car silently gliding down the street, remember one thing. Behind that screen, that battery, and that seemingly clean motor lies a massive chain of mines, refineries, cargo ships, factories, contracts, and geopolitical disputes. The future may be electric. It may be greener. But before it ever reaches the outlet, it begins in the ground beneath our feet. And maybe that is the greatest irony of the new gold rush. The treasure of the future isn't sparkling in a shop window. It is hidden inside the rock. And whoever figures out how to turn that rock into technology might just end up holding one of the keys to global power.